Well, thank you for those who stayed for what I think is going to be the most exciting part of our program today, our panel discussion on job growth in the Midwest. And we've got some pretty good discussion I'm sure we'll have, maybe even a little debate. My name is David Heinke. I'm with the public accounting firm of Grant Thornton. Thank you for attending today. We love working with dynamic companies at Grant Thornton. Want to appreciate all of our attendees today and their dynamic companies for participating. I also want to thank our panelists for carving time out of their schedules to participate today. And if you might, all of you, would you both raise both your hands, please? All of the participants, just raise both hands up in the air. Ah, terrific. Harry Truman used to have a saying that he was always looking for a one-handed economist because economists were always saying on the one hand and then the other. I have no one-handed economists on the panel today. And in deference to Derrick and Caralynn, they're not economists anyway, so you get a bye. But we are here today to talk about job growth and want to thank them for being here. And before we get going with questions, we're going to have a brief presentation, 5 minutes apiece for our panelists. And Anil, if you could lead us off.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So earlier on, I was happy to share some statistics for the national survey. Now I'll share with you the corresponding numbers for Illinois. But before I do that, some caveats are in order, I think. The national survey was obviously much larger. It had more than 1,000 respondents. So when we looked for all those who were from Illinois, unfortunately the sample isn't that large and robust. We're talking only about 70 people. That said, but I suspect that these 70 are more likely, based on some of the statistics you already saw in Mr. Herman Brewer's presentation, they're likely to be Chicago firms and CEOs or C-level executives. So here are the Illinois statistics and how they compare with the national. In terms of the actual experienced revenue growth, so this is again sitting in December, looking the year back, the revenues for Illinois firms on average grew by about 3.88%. Recall, the national average was 7%. And by the way, I gave you the mean. The median represents a little worse. So apparently, there were some outliers in terms of the mean growth of 3.88, but otherwise, the median was just 2%. In terms of employment, I think Illinois seemed to lag a little more because the average growth of employment was, in fact, slightly negative. And the median was absolutely no change. And you'll recall that for the national statistics, it was about 2.7%. So generally, the picture you get from at least the recent experiences are kind of a relative falling behind relative to the national numbers. Looking forward, however, the picture is more optimistic. And in fact, Illinois firms on average expect about 4.53%, 4.5% revenue growth, so the coming year, which is of course heartening. And that compares well with the national of 5.2%. Remember, our sample is kind of small, so we can't make too much of a big deal of some of the differences. So that's a positive. And in terms of employment, again, so I see this kind of a positive change taking place here because the projected employment is expected for the sample of 70 to grow by about 1.9%, and this is the mean, whereas the national expected is 2.3%. Again, wouldn't make a big deal of the differences. Where would people want to hire? It seems like for operations, marketing and sales, and IT. 73% of the hiring would go towards adding full-time jobs, the rest coming from part-time and temporaries and so forth. In terms of confidence, I see that the global and US confidence levels are similar between Illinois and across the nation. However, I might say that the local and regional confidence is a little behind. Again, I wouldn't make a big deal. 66% of the respondents in the Illinois sample show some level of confidence. The national is 71%. So, you know, whatever you want to make of that little difference there. However, when it comes to the main challenges, we had seen that healthcare was showing up very dominantly in the national sample. In the Illinois sample, it does not. A fairly small percentage of the Illinois firms highlighted healthcare costs, or for that matter, even government action. So Mr. Miller, Mr. Herman Brewer might have already taken care of that problem. In terms of where would you put an extra dollar? Again, as I said, I think there's more heartening news going forward. Very good numbers for Illinois. Only 30% of the respondents would put that extra dollar into cash or short term. Instead, the national number, as you recall, was 41%. So that, I think, is a remarkable enough difference. And it seems to go, the bulk of that spending seems to go into plant and equipment. Talking to what had been earlier mentioned by Ben, indeed, there is investment also happening locally. Let me jump a little bit here and also point out about the fiscal cliff affecting investment, the uncertainty attached to the fiscal cliff rather, and indeed Illinois also seemed to have reduced investment on account of those uncertainties. And that was something like 2.78% for Illinois. The national was 4.8%, so not as dramatic perhaps. And is there uncertainty left over beyond that? Pretty much like the national sample, yes. There's overwhelming sense that there is a lot of uncertainty left over on account of government activity. Let me just end by one other statistic, which I don't have the corresponding national statistic in this case, and that is about 74% of the revenue of the Illinois firms comes from domestic business. Just about only 1% comes from Europe. So what happens in Cyprus, don't worry about it. Thank you.
Ben?
I'm going to yield my time to the other panelists.
Okay.
And get to the Q&A.
Terrific. Tim Classen.
That was
Mike, are those your slides?
those were mine.
I'm sorry, Mike.
That's all right. You want me to do it from
Take it
there
away,
or here?
Mr. Miller.
What's that?
Take it away, Dr. Miller.
Oh, may I have the clicker?
You
so I
certainly
can
may.
Forward those. Yes. I get the distinct pleasure of being the wet blanket. I've been listening to it, and I'm an optimist, by the way. I'm a Hawks fan, so everything is going well. But I didn't realize when we were talking on the phone in preparation that I would be the wet blanket here. We were supposed to talk about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and here goes. The context we want to first establish is we've just come out of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and we've just had the weakest expansion, or the weakest recovery on record. Normal recovery takes 2 to 4 quarters. This one took 10. 2.5 years before we ever even got back to the original GDP at the start of the recession. Unemployment, well, it's moving in the right direction. I mentioned there that we have, jobs are being created. We could create at the rate that we're doing it right now, and it will take us 4 years to get back to about 5% unemployment. 4 years. The expansion will probably be over by then, so we may not get back to where we want to be. There are some positives here, but keep in mind that last quarter, the fourth quarter of 2012, the economy was growing a whopping 0.1%, which means it was dead in the water. So any kind of growth is an improvement over no growth at all. So we do see, though, household wealth is rising for 2 reasons. Houses are starting to sell, not so much in Illinois or Chicago, but houses nationwide are beginning to sell, which is raising wealth, which will help and lead to spending. But incomes, I don't know about your incomes, but I look at mine and I never go anywhere. I do a good job at university. University is reasonably successful, and I just don't get anywhere. Our incomes are not rising only about as quickly as the inflation rate is rising. So we're not making a whole lot of headway there. But manufacturing is doing well. If you look at the ISM index and industrial production, looks like we're off to a good start for 2013. Again, we have to realize we're comparing this in some sense to what was happening at the end of 2012. So, and we see that the economy is reviving, and I want to say somewhat in spite of government policies. And the reason I bring that up is not to be partisan. It's because some research I'm going to show you. I'm coming at this as an applied macroeconomist in a world of academia, not in the real world that you are in, but in this academic world, where I'm going to be guided by empirical questions, and I look at what does the research tell me? What the people have looked at these questions in detail, looking at the data, what do they find? So what we find is what you've heard about job creation is true. New jobs come from small businesses. Now, they don't always last very long. So one thing is lots of new jobs are created in small businesses, and then those businesses go out of business. But these people get their first shot at the labor market. They get skills, which they can then sell onto the market and move up from there. But it's even more than that. The new jobs come from new small businesses. So the key to getting jobs in the Midwest or anywhere in the country would be entrepreneurial innovation, which we've talked about here. That this innovation, Ben was talking about, is absolutely key to any kind of economic growth. So but if people are going to take those chances, they have to be rewarded. And they have to feel that once they make it, that they will be able to keep the fruits of their labor. And I'm not so sure that that's necessarily the tone that's trying to be set either in Illinois or in the federal government as a whole. Although if success is not something that should be lauded, but we have, well, I get that feeling that growth cannot be as great if it's not perceived as success is a good thing. Next thing. Why aren't we doing better? Why is it that we have 10 quarters to grow just to get back to where we were at the start of the Great Recession? Why are we growing at 0.1% in the fourth quarter of last year? This piece of research that I looked at here, it struck, I was even surprised. I mean, I look at lots and lots of research. That's what I do during the day. I have my face in front of the screen looking at research after research after research. And this one just stunned me, that it appears that, based upon some research out of the San Francisco Fed, that the uncertainty that exists in Washington may have added as much to 1 to 2 percentage points to the unemployment rate. Now, when you add on top of that most research shows that about 1% is added to the unemployment rate due to unemployment compensation being extended. Now, of course, this makes you, again, the cold-hearted person that you don't want people to have unemployment comp. But we economists know that when there are incentives not to go to work, you don't go to work. And almost all the research is perfectly clear that it does add to the unemployment rate. So you add that particular action by the government, and then you add the fact that I don't care what side of the politics you're on in terms of doing something in Washington, just do something, make it clear what's going to be done, what the tax rates are going to be, what the tone is going to be, but we can't even do that. And again, I was struck by the research, that it was that very, very important. Also, keep in mind, I know there is an issue regarding job, that the workers exactly match what jobs are out there. And this is always the case in the economy. But study after study after study has been done to try to figure out in this Great Recession and the weak aftermath, why are there not jobs? And there appears to be one solid answer: a lack of demand. You and I are simply not spending. Corporations, if you look at what is called fixed investment, it's going absolutely nowhere. If you look at the corporation, we were talking about how much money. I almost thought it had to be another print typo. It was in the FT last night that by the end of this year, Apple is going to have in hand $170 billion in cash and liquid securities. That's, to me, stunning. Now, of course, there are 50 companies who have more than $5 billion in cash in this country. They're sitting because they just don't know what's going to happen. Now, when you and I had begin to spend because our wealth is rising, and if our incomes ever begin to rise more quickly, that'll be cool. If people get employed and they have money to spend, that will get things going, and it'll be like a rock rolling down the hill, picking up energy. And this might be the year that that's going to happen because housing is turning around, and let's hope that maybe the stock market by the end of the year has a good gain, not the craziness maybe we're seeing right now. Okay, but let's also look at one other issue. There are threats. I'm not sure what the threat is from Obamacare. I just know that almost every time I pick up the paper, there's another tax, which, oh, did you realize every corporation is going to have to pay $63 per employee who is under Obamacare. This is the one we got a couple days ago. I don't know what this is going to do to firms that hire the high school kids that you were talking about. They come in with very few skills. They can't produce much output. But if a corporation or a firm has to pay a large amount of money for health care, whatever, just think what happens to the wage bill of that person. It goes up dramatically. Their skills do not go up. What happens to them? Well, you look for alternatives. Of course, we say that the rise in the minimum wage, for example, adds to productivity. Well, yeah, it does, because in many cases, we substitute away from the worker and put in more capital so that the ones that do remain are more productive. But the unemployment rate doesn't fall because of that. And the one other one, let's take a look at the Midwest. Now, I was on the panel last year, and I was kind of a little bit of a wet blanket then. And I'm an optimist. I am an optimist. Someday the Cubs will win, for example. I am an optimist. But since last year, anybody in this room knows, Illinois was declared the most corrupt state in the country. Our credit rating was lowered. And everybody in this room understands that that pension problem that just keeps festering and building and building, everybody in here, me included, we're going to have to pay for that. It's going to come out of something. Now, we know that we all have this tax, this temporary tax, 2 percentage points to our income tax, which is supposed to go away. You know that's not going to go away. And all these pensions, they're thinking of transferring them to the local governments, which means all of our real estate taxes are going to have to go up to pay for this. Now, the only reason I bring this up, if every state around us was in exactly the same situation, and people had to create businesses, where would they go? Well, since they're all bad, let's go anywhere. But think of what's going on in Wisconsin, what's going on in Indiana, what's going on in Missouri. We're not competitive. And in many cases, you can locate a business right across the border and do some business over here, but get out of this state because we're broken. I mean, what's happening in Springfield, it's broken. And my kids, I'm hoping they will stay. I want someday to have grandchildren. I want them to be around and be part of that. But my kids say, one says, other than the Blackhawks, there's no reason to stay in Illinois. There really isn't. Now, he's still here, but there's really nothing that's keeping him here. And so my fear is that the rest of the country, just like it's happening now with real estate's doing well. The rest of the country's doing well. We're not doing quite as well. I'm afraid that Illinois is going to be left behind, and that the problem of the government, which is a federal problem, is going to filter down into the state, and people will see the state as dysfunctional, and that's going to create a lack of jobs. So again, maybe this would be the clarion call that let's do something. Let's do something in Springfield. Let's do something in Northern Illinois to get rid of these problems. And so that's my wet blanket. Okay.
I don't think you're a wet blanket.
Yeah, well.
Tim?
And now for something really depressing. No. Hi, I'm Tim Classen from Loyola University here in Chicago. I'm a health economist at the Quinlan School of Business. And just to get in a plug, I think one of the issues in healthcare that we're really facing, along with the retirement of baby boomers stimulating demand for healthcare services, there are a lot of physicians in that cohort who are retiring, and there's a real need for leadership and management in that field of healthcare to understand the unique clinical aspects as well as the economic aspects of this field. And so about 5 years ago, we started an executive MBA program in healthcare management that is trying to train people to fill the slots in leadership that is needed in this field. I think when you think about the field of healthcare and the inefficiencies associated with it, so I have about 5 minutes to talk about 18% of our economy, so I'm going to talk fast probably. We have some real concerns over how we spend that $2.7 trillion that we spend on healthcare now. Some estimates say we have about $600 billion of waste. You're all familiar with how markets work. You would think markets would drive out waste. And so there's always the question of why in healthcare does waste persist? Why do we have inefficient services where up to 100,000 people are killed by our healthcare system every year that's trying to save them? So I'll just talk about kind of on the one hand, I'll talk about demand, and on the other hand, we'll talk about supply issues. So associated with Obamacare, as you're probably familiar, are some things to stimulate demand for healthcare services. Obviously, the main feature of that is the expansion of health insurance coverage to about 40 million of our uninsured population. So about half of that, about 20 million people, will be covered through a Medicaid expansion, and about half of them will be covered through the state-level health insurance exchanges that were recently submitted to the federal government. So obviously, that's going to have a big effect on demand for services, affecting our demand for physicians, nurses, hospitals, and devices. To add 40 million people, there's over a 10% increase in the population with insurance, likely to really increase demand. Perhaps some of your children have already realized that change in Obamacare was being able to be covered by your insurance plans up to age 26 has had an increase in the coverage rates for the younger population. Again, when we think about self-employment, the need for entrepreneurship, the ability to go out and start new businesses, coverage for the younger people who present relatively attractive health risks to insurers is an attractive way to increase coverage by allowing them to go out and do what they want to do with the reassurance that they have some sort of coverage. Locally, on the supply side in the healthcare market, there's been a lot of expansion recently, just in the last year, of hospital facilities. So Rush, the University of Chicago, and Children's Memorial Hospital all added about $2 billion of facilities opened up in the last year. So an incredible influx of building in the Chicago area. A hospital of $150 million expansion just took place in Glenbrook, and the Rehabilitation Institute over in Streeterville has proposed building a $500 million facility in Streeterville. That's subject to regulatory review, of course. Whether there's need for that is still up for debate. But a lot of building is going on, some of that related to this expansion in demand for services by the expanding health insurance coverage of people. A lot of that also relates to the growing spending on Medicare. So obviously right now we're undergoing the retirement of the baby boomers and expanding. There's a lot of regulatory uncertainty over what to do with Medicare. Some of that is addressed through Obamacare, some of that is still up for debate. Obviously, one part of Medicare that will be likely contracting in the future are the private plans available through Medicare Advantage. So managed care plans that are currently offered through Medicare to Medicare beneficiaries are likely to be shrinking based on reduced payments to those managed care groups. One thing that should be noted is Medicaid. About 75% of Medicaid beneficiaries now get their coverage through managed care groups. And so with the expansion of Medicaid, demand for managed care services are likely to be increased quite a bit. Another big change that's going on right now in terms of the delivery of care is the integration of physician groups into hospitals. There's been a lot of buying by hospitals and managed care groups of larger physician practices. Some of that's due to the preferences of new docs. New doctors seem to be more risk averse than their predecessors. The independent physician is perhaps a dying breed, and many more physicians are going into a salaried arrangement with healthcare providers. So advocate physicians now bring in about $875 million into their group. So Advocate's been a very active buyer of physician services. Some of this is driven by the latest acronym in healthcare you've probably heard of, the ACO. So we had HMOs, PPOs, and now we're heading toward a system of accountable care organizations where really the paying structure, the reimbursement structure is likely driving us toward a system of more integrated services where physicians are employed by hospitals and there's bundled payments going toward all of the care instead of piecemeal where the physician gets paid separately from the hospital. Perhaps of most interest to you is the new taxes that have been implemented for medical care devices. So as of January 1st of this year, there was a 2.3% tax added to gross sales for medical care devices to raise about $2 to $3 billion annually to cover some of the cost of the Obamacare expansion. Now what's interesting is how much attention that gets relative to the increased payroll tax on Medicare, that those incomes above $200,000 are now paying almost 1% higher of payroll taxes. That's going to raise about $20 billion, whereas the medical device tax is going to raise about $2 billion. Obviously, locally, Baxter and Abbott are potentially affected by this. Abbott spun off their pharmaceutical division at the beginning of this year. Regionally, with Medtronic being the leading medical device provider up in Minnesota, Indiana is also a large provider of medical device services. I do think it's interesting that at the federal level, the support to repeal this medical device tax goes from Elizabeth Warren, Al Franken, and John Kerry to the House Republicans. So perhaps anything where you can get that kind of consensus on perhaps merits some consideration to repeal this tax. Again, the idea of a tax, though, who bears the cost of a tax is driven by the relative responsiveness of demand and supply. So for those medical device providers that are providing essential devices to the quality of health care in our system, in general, a lot of the tax can be passed on to consumers. Why are taxes easily passed on to consumers in health care is because the nature of our insurance system that really distorts prices, and consumers really don't know what they're paying for things. So typically that's led to a lot of price growth. Our spending growth, if we're trying to bend the cost curve, we have to think about how we spend on things, and that involves prices. So either physicians get paid less, hospitals already have basically no margin for making less, and then so it goes to devices and the technologies that we have to cut costs. So if we're going to cut costs somewhere, it's got to come from one of those three constituencies. And so devices have been targeted for that. So that certainly creates concerns. But again, for companies producing essential inputs, they're unlikely to be affected directly if they can pass on the tax through higher prices. And then one last thing, since I spent 6 years in grad school up in Madison, the expansion of electronic medical records with companies like Epic Systems are really kind of a greatly expanding role for IT in healthcare delivery. Medicare and the administration are really incentivizing hospitals to invest in EMRs by paying less for hospitals that aren't doing that. So a big expansion in both devices and EMRs. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Derrick?
Good morning. Again, Derrick Collins, Dean, College of Business, Chicago State University. And I wanted to talk just a moment about our contribution, attempt to contribute to the job growth in the Midwest. Our efforts at Chicago State University, and especially the College of Business, seeks to take entrepreneurship beyond the classroom to help build our local community. The university takes serious its role as a community partner, and as such, we try to focus on entrepreneurial development. We believe that entrepreneurial development will lead to job creation and therefore advance the community. I think everyone in this room just about understands that linkage between entrepreneurial development and job creation and therefore local development. As a university and within the framework of our mission and what we're supposed to do, we believe we're in a unique position to actually assist in this kind of development. First, the basics. The institution is a teaching institution. It's an educator. It's an education institution. So to the extent that we can provide education in terms of entrepreneurship, that knowledge transfer to folks, we think that we are contributing. Now, in doing this, we start with kind of the basics, the classes, the curriculum that our students attend the classes for in terms of entrepreneurship and other kinds of business endeavors. But to maximize the impact, we have to be able to go beyond that classroom to be able to get to the business folks, get to the entrepreneurs that are within that area. So in kind of just basic terms, we kind of divide these folks into kind of three basic groups, if you will. First, we have our aspiring, or our aspirants, the folks that are the dreamers, the folks that have the startup ideas, most of which are our students, and then a few folks in the local community that are startup kind of folks. Then we have the strivers. These are the young companies, the entrepreneurs that are just getting started. Their main goal is just to be able to survive and get to the point where they start to thrive a little bit. But the first order of business is just to survive and be able to support themselves and their families. And then after you get that, you have this group of folks that are, for lack of a better term, we call kind of the empire builders. These are folks that kind of broken into the middle market. They are beyond just mere survival, but looking to kind of grow and build an enterprise that's going to be lasting and have some real impact. And the kind of education, the kind of knowledge that each of those three groups desire and need are different. And so our challenge is to be able to provide venues, be able to provide different forums such that the knowledge for those different groups are provided. And so we try to do that through, obviously, through the classroom. We also do that through our relationship with our, with respect to workshops, forums, and in many cases, direct consultation. The last couple of categories being done via our Small Business Development Center, which is also part of the College of Business. Now, once we get beyond the classroom, beyond the theory, we want to be able to try to put this theory into practice. And therefore, we then seek to engage and develop and utilize various experiential kinds of initiatives in linking the students to real-life experience that can help develop their entrepreneurial acumen. So that can go from students working with a local business to help them to address a unique business challenge or meet a market opportunity. It could be helping the student to actually develop their own particular entrepreneurial endeavor as well. So it could be go the gamut of the local entrepreneur, helping them develop their own enterprise e-commerce platform, all the way to a group of students that recently helped a local business develop a relational database to better track and use analytics for their customer base. And going beyond the experiential, we have the education level, we have the experiential kinds of initiatives. We think there's one other area where the university can be uniquely positioned to kind of help, again, move forward and assist with entrepreneurial development in the local community, and we believe that that is in research. We believe that to the extent that we can provide some real research that addresses the unique challenges, opportunities within the urban business corridor for the businesses in our particular communities, to the extent they become a little bit more knowledgeable about what's going on, and we conduct research that is not easily done from a local single entrepreneur perspective, we think that could be helpful. We think it could be impactful in the medium to long term. So those are just a few of the things that we're trying to do in terms of utilizing the university, again, within its mission, within its core business, if you will, in helping to advance and move forward entrepreneurial development, which we look forward to helping with job creation and therefore stronger communities.
Terrific, Derrick. Thank you. And Caralynn, if you'd be kind.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caralynn Nowinski. I'm the Associate Vice President for Innovation and Economic Development at the University of Illinois. Is that better? Okay. I wanted to first thank Craig and David for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what we're doing at U of I across our campuses in Chicago, Urbana-Champaign, and Springfield, and specifically talk about what is the role of the university as it relates to fostering economic growth in our region. And I know in a little bit we're going to hear from Ira, who's going to talk a little bit more about startup companies in the entrepreneurial world. So I'm going to try to touch on some of the things that we've put in place to really foster academic and industry collaboration. So for us, we see the innovation ecosystem as having several requisite elements that we try to develop programs that that help develop this ecosystem by through supporting research, providing opportunities for commercialization, and overall doing all of this to ensure our economic competitiveness. In 2000, the Illinois General Assembly I think did something very smart when they mandated that their public research, or the public universities within Illinois, had to utilize their assets and resources for economic growth. And that actually prompted our Board of Trustees at the University of Illinois to add economic development as the fourth mission. So it's teaching, it's research, it's outreach, and economic development. And so since then, we've really invested quite a bit into creating this type of infrastructure. You know, I think it was really fitting, actually, that Ben had mentioned President Lincoln earlier, because in addition to being an innovator himself, he also implemented innovative practices for how universities work. And about 150 years ago, he established the land-grant university, and University of Illinois being one of those universities. The mission of the land-grant university is worth mentioning, because it was really to train the industrial class. And all of us have been talking about talent and skilled workforce, technical talent, entrepreneurial talent, and really that's exactly what the mission of the land-grant university is. So we've really tried to embrace that at U of I and think about what does it mean to educate these workers of the next generation. And you know, we're really proud of some of the companies and the entrepreneurs that have come out of our institution. We've heard earlier about the Mosaic browser, which later became Netscape. You're probably also familiar with database systems and other IT systems like Siebel or Oracle, and of course our household names like YouTube and PayPal and Yelp, things we use probably on a near daily basis, all of which came out of students or alums from the University of Illinois. So we've as I said, we felt like we needed to do our part. And so since 2000, we've really been investing quite a bit in our infrastructure, over $500 million, and I'm sure that number has gone up even since I last checked. But I want to highlight a couple of these things. First, many of you may not be aware that we've got a great research park about 2 hours south of us, and in Champaign, Illinois, the University of Illinois Research Park, which was founded in 2000. Today has 12 buildings, 100 more acres they're going to be developing. 90 companies are there, including companies like Cat and Deere and State Farm and Abbott and others, and produces an economic impact of $170 million annually. We think that's pretty darn good for Champaign, Illinois. We also created investment vehicles like Illinois Ventures, which has helped fund 70 companies. And those 70 companies have gone on to raise 13 times their initial investment. It's over $550 million in outside capital. And then, again, that's all since 2001. Our tech transfer offices, or our offices of technology management, have had a record of 106 patents last year. We licensed over 90 technologies to startups or companies last year. And in fact, of the top 10 sources of intellectual property in Illinois, U of I is the only university on that list. Obviously, we've got great things going on at all of our universities, but I've got to give the plug to mine as well. But we've really been working in collaboration with a lot of our partners to be able to translate some of these models to Chicago, working with many of the universities that are represented up here. And in fact, even Tim had alluded to a lot of the infrastructure investment in the research, in the medical research space. And we're working on translating some of our models in the research park to the Illinois Medical District here in Chicago, developing both accelerator and incubator services to foster more entrepreneurs in those spaces. Now, as I mentioned, we're really proud of the accomplishments that we've had, but we've really done this because we recognize that startups are the foundation of job growth. But this is where kind of the pretty picture ends for my story, because we also know we've got a lot of problems. And one of the biggest, of course, is the challenges in federal R&D funding. The University of Illinois brings in from industry and federal R&D dollars about $1 billion annually. But you can see the shift that's been happening over the last 60 years or so, and where if you can't quite read it, what it's showing is industry is responsible for an overwhelming amount of R&D, and federal research funding is going down. What you don't see on this chart is the fact that just R&D funding in general has really been going down and is really not competitive with our players in other global markets. And so what is our responsibility if we want to maintain the competitiveness of our nation in terms of making the types of investments that we need to make? The quote on the last page was, actually I'll go back to it, was a quote out of Thomas Friedman's book a couple years ago, saying that we need to reinvest in our formula. And I wanted to juxtapose that with a quote from not popular press. This is the National Academy's report that came out last summer that said, we don't have infrastructure in place like institutions like Bell Labs, these corporate research institutes. And so I'd argue we might want to add that to the list of things that are missing that we've got to address for us to become a global destination for technology here in Chicago. How does industry and academia work together to translate new technologies into products that we commercialize? So we've been trying to develop some of these new models. We've been working with several large companies. We have about 400 corporate partnerships annually. I listed a few up here of the more recent ones, and I just want to highlight two that I think are particularly innovative. We recently welcomed Dow Chemical to our research park, and they're going to be creating an IT innovation center there. In addition, though, to their commitment to the research park in Champaign-Urbana, they've also developed a strategic university partnership with the university, which means they're going to be doing creative innovation with our scientists in materials and chemistry and in engineering more broadly. And they've also developed programs with their students to be able to bring them into projects that they have and be able to develop the talent. And they've also partnered with our National Center for Supercomputing Applications, our High Performance Computing Center, NCSA, to be able to access the digital tools that they think that they need to be more competitive moving forward in terms of modeling and simulation and other types of digital tools. And those digital tools we're seeing increasingly in demand by all parts of the market, and including the middle market, so particularly relevant for the conversation we have today. NCSA was also one of the founding partners of a collaboration called Endemic, which was funded by both federal investors as well as private investors, including P&G, GE, Lockheed Martin, and Deere. And this was a pilot study that will be wrapping up in June, where these 4 OEMs made the conscious investment to arm their supply chain with digital tools for modeling and simulations that they felt they needed to enhance manufacturing excellence. And we're working now on developing programs to continue that type of pilot to be able to arm our manufacturing base with those types of tools they need. So going ahead, I expect that universities are increasingly going to be thinking about what type of investments they need to make to bring together academia and industry so that we can really contribute to the growth here and to our competitiveness. We've been announcing some of those initiatives in recent news, so a little question mark over there. We'll see what's next, but I encourage you all to pay attention to what we're talking about with an initiative we announced earlier this year called UI Labs, and something that we hope to do in partnership with other major academic and research institutions and national labs right alongside industry, where we bring scientists from industry and academia alongside one another, along with students, to be able to solve grand societal problems. I think these are the types of models that we need to be thinking more and more about to be able to create the kind of economic growth that we want to see in Chicago.
Very exciting, Carolyn. Thank you. Ira?
Was it just the next
Right,
slide?
on the right side.
Yep. Oh, okay. Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. Professor Ben and Mike both actually talked about how innovation essentially is one of the big keys to job growth. And so what I thought I would talk about, I kind of live at this juxtaposition of academia and then also startups. And so if you actually look at what ends up creating jobs and how many jobs are created by various things, if you have early stage financings, typically a company that does an early stage financing will create somewhere between 10 and 30 jobs. If it's a mid-stage financing, it's somewhere between 30 and 50 jobs. And then if it's a later stage financing of a growth company, it's somewhere between 50 and 200 jobs. So I've pulled some data that I'll talk a little bit about later, showing essentially what are both the number and amount of financings that have occurred in the Midwest relative to the rest of the country, and then also a little bit of a horse race between Illinois and some of the surrounding states to see kind of how are we doing. And the data is not may not be as bad as kind of Mike was suggesting earlier. So, and personally, I'm actually pretty relatively optimistic about the Chicago area in particular, even the Midwest, in terms of the early stage startup and even a little bit of the venture community. Not as optimistic about the venture community, but definitely the startup community. And some of it actually comes out of Next Big Sound, which is what Ben was talking about earlier. It's a company that is looking for the next big sound, and tried to do it a little bit in Chicago, but then quickly moved to Boulder. But not only did Next Big Sound move to Boulder, but in Techstars is an accelerator. And in that year's class at Techstars, there were 3 Chicago companies that had all moved to Boulder instead of staying in Chicago to try to start their company. And so in some ways, partially out of that, there were some people from the Chicago community that were there in Boulder at this Techstars location, came back to Chicago and said, you know what, we need to have an accelerator here in Chicago. And so they started an accelerator called Accelerate Labs. They had wanted to start a Techstars location. But Techstars in some ways rejected us. And so they started something called Accelerate Labs. And what I can report to you is after 3 years of Accelerate Labs, this year we have been Accelerate has been rebranded as a Techstars location. So we were now called Techstars Chicago, which is just, shows you some ways the revitalization of the community in Chicago. So I'll talk a little bit about just entrepreneurship at Chicago booth, but just briefly, these are, except if you're working in the early stage community, you may typically think of Chicago booth mostly as a finance school or an economics school. But actually in particularly the last, kind of 5 to 10 years, we've really come into our own in terms of entrepreneurship. It's actually become, surprisingly enough, the second largest concentration for students who are getting an MBA at Chicago booth. We're generally ranked top 5 in entrepreneurship programs by Business Week in 2012, ranked top 10 by Princeton Review. Usually on kind of on those lists. Similar to Northwestern, we've got some some great entrepreneurship classes that have won awards, and generally things have been going strong at the school from that perspective. We have our Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship. We got a relatively large donation. I think it was 6 or 7 years ago from Michael Polsky of $5 million, who this last year actually donated an additional $8 million to expand entrepreneurship essentially from Chicago booth to throughout the University of Chicago. So, really I think it's a testament to the work that some of my colleagues have done. And the underlying philosophy essentially is to really give people experiential learning opportunities and not just academic learning opportunities. So help with them on their startups, put them out into startups in the community, give them opportunities in venture capital as well. So a bunch of different courses. There's, we have 27 entrepreneurship courses throughout the school at this point. And I think what generally we like to talk the most about school-wise is some of the success stories, because really, how are you going to get people to start companies in Chicago and want to stay in Chicago? It's at the end of the day, it's by having brand name success stories that people can point to. So actually, Groupon, at least for a while, was that incredible success story that we could all point to and say, well, yes, it can be done in Chicago. But there are other companies that have also been started in Chicago that, I don't know that they'll be the full success, $5 to $10 billion success of Groupon, although I don't know, maybe it's at $3 or $4 billion at this point. But here are some companies that have come out of our business plan competition, and there's similar business plan competitions at other schools in the area. But the two kind of bigger ones that in some ways, at least in our community and on the coast, are household names in terms of the venture community. One is Grubhub, which many of you hopefully have heard of, which is a fast food delivery website. And most people say it's a likely exit that's in the $1 billion to $2 billion range, might go public this year. And also a company called Braintree, which probably is in that same range. And what I'll say about those kinds of companies is that each of those companies, which were startups 4 or 5 years ago, actually I guess 6 or 7 years ago probably is when they were started, at this point employ over 300 people. And they went essentially from 0 to 300 plus people. Most of those are in the Chicago area. And if you think about Next Big Sound, what did they do? Well, they went to Boulder, and after going to Boulder, they actually didn't come back to Chicago, which is what their roots were, but they went to New York. And so they've employed probably, I think they're probably at 100 plus people in the New York area, essentially being close to their customers. One thing that is good about the Chicago area in the mid to long term for that is that we do have a lot of big business in Chicago. It's a lot of customers here that are good possibilities for early stage companies. I also, the other hat I wear is I'm a partner at a venture fund called Hyde Park Venture Partners, and we've grown this group called Hyde Park Angels, which is an angel group that's come out of, essentially was started by some alumni in the business school at the University of Chicago. Started with 7 members, is now up to 110 members. It's really, really been active. We use some Chicago booth MBA students and undergrads to help create opportunities. And the biggest testament I think we have is that a couple of years after we started, Northwestern started Wildcat Angels. So we view that as a success. And there's other angel groups in the area as well. So You know, we've invested about a little over $10 million as a group. You know, it's been increasing. It was $2 million in 2010, up to $3.5 million this last year, and you know, it's a pretty increasing pace. And if you kind of look at the Chicago area ecosystem, and I will get into the data in a moment here, you know, there are some. You know, if you think about what's going on both on the seed side, you know, and the important thing is getting things funded kind of at the seed and early stage, because if you don't get them funded then, that's when companies are most likely to kind of flee to the coast. Once they're established here, it's a little harder to get them out. So, you know, there's groups like Hyde Park Angels, Hyde Park Venture Partners, but also there's the Firestarter Fund. Light Bank has been funding, you know, had been at least on an incredible pace of funding companies. There's a fund called the Firestarter Fund of some entrepreneurs. There's the I2A Fund, a bunch of different groups that have been doing these early stage financings. And then also on the startup kind of ecosystem side, as Ben talked about earlier, there's 1871, which if you have not been to the 12th floor of the Merchandise Mart to check out the 1871, the year of the Chicago fire, they're, you know, representing the hopeful revitalization of the tech community in and around Chicago. It's a pretty amazing space. There's also a website called Built in Chicago, which has been really flourishing, so much so that actually they've launched websites on in some other communities like Built in Denver and elsewhere, which is really a Chicago initiative. And you know, there's a variety of other groups, including Accelerate, which is now Techstars. So you know, pulled a little bit of data just to, you know, kind of think about what's going on in Chicago, in some ways relative to the rest of the country, not Chicago, but really the Midwest. So, you know, this is really just raw data on the number of startups and the number of funding dollars that have gone in the Midwest. And then also you always, you know, you kind of always pull California out to show how minuscule we are. If you take like all of the Midwest states combined compared to California, we're still, you know, pretty small from that perspective. So we certainly severely lag California, but if you look at least in terms of the last 4 to 5 years, definitely the number of companies has been increasing, the number of companies that have been started each year, and even this is not adjusted for inflation, but you know, at least the raw dollars have been pretty significant and remaining pretty high over the last 5 years in the Midwest. And one thing I'll point out about these numbers is it's actually much less costly to start a company now than it was, you know, probably 10 years ago, particularly in the tech space. So really, you know, the money that goes into companies goes a much further away, at, you know, particularly at the early stages. So if you look, you know, what I wanted to think about is like what's gone on to the Midwest relative to the rest of the country. And, you know, just looking, kind of taking away the, you know, the tech bubble period time frame, the solid line there is the percent of all this, and this is data from VentureSource, but this is of all financings that have occurred in the country, all venture financings that have occurred, venture and other early stage financings, what percent are in the Midwest? And so I certainly couldn't say this was statistically significant, but we've at least been holding our own and actually increased a bit. So as a share of total number of companies, and the data actually is similar if you do it on a dollar amount, the share total number of companies, it was 6% back in 2003, but is it up to about 7.5% in terms of the number of companies that have started. And then if you also look, you know, kind of a bake-off between some of the different, you know, Illinois versus other states, if you look, Michigan has a lot of, Michigan actually, Wisconsin also, definitely have, Michigan even more so, has tons of incentives for people to start companies, and you see it playing out in the dollar. In the percentage, this is a percent of companies within the Midwest that are started. So where are the companies being started in the Midwest? You know, kind of thinking of, well, are we competing against, you know, people moving to Wisconsin or elsewhere? And, you know, Michigan, Illinois has pretty much held its own, actually. So I know, you know, Mike could probably tell you some really good stories of, you know, a company called Fat Wallet, which moved to Wisconsin, and all these different, you know, a few different startups for tax and other reasons that have moved out of Illinois. But mostly the people within the Chicago area, people who are startup entrepreneurs, generally feel like, well, I'm going to make so much money that I don't need to worry about taxes at this point. That's what their hope is, at least. So if you look at the share, so Michigan has definitely gone up from, you know, probably 10 to about 15%. It's almost a continual increase, lots and lots of incentives. The one state that seems like it's been going down pretty significantly in terms of starts is Minnesota, which is probably because the number of companies started in the medical device space has actually gone down pretty significantly. Minnesota is an unbelievable hotbed, particularly Minneapolis, of medical device startups. So anyways, this is just a little bit on kind of, job growth through venture and startup creation.
Thank you, Ira. You've all been very patient out in the audience. We'd like to open it up now for questions as it relates to our panel. Anybody have any questions? Yes, Warren.
A lot of discussion has been about tech companies. What about other companies starting up as entrepreneurs?
Well, I guess I should point out, yeah, this data actually is not just for tech. So the data that I had put up, at least, I do more in that world, but the data collectively is tech and non-tech. But that data is only about venture financings. So it could be, healthcare services, a variety of different companies. A little less on the manufacturing side, but certainly more inclusive than just tech.
Let me just add that for our perspective, from the Chicago State perspective, the local community, if we're going to help our local entrepreneurs, then you'll have some that will be technology-based companies, but many of them will be more than likely service companies and the like. So as we further develop our support services, we know that one of the areas we really have to have a robust in will be in the services area, services and retail, because that's a lot of where the need is going to be for us.
Anil, anything you saw in your data as it relates to manufacturing?
But I think the question was whether this activity is more tech. What I can say is that in the middle market, the representation is more on services and then manufacturing. Those are like the top two.
Caralynn, I apologize. You were going to say something.
I was just going to add, like Ira had pointed out, to the companies I talked about at the University of Illinois are, I would say that probably in aggregate, the total number of companies represent a large percentage of manufacturing companies, because we think about companies that are developing even medical devices or new materials or sensors. I mean, that's still in some ways considered a manufacturing company. So we've been trying to broaden kind of the way we think about manufacturing and kind of the advanced tools and resources that that companies are going to be moving into their manufacturing base.
Yep, man.
Yeah, I think it goes well beyond tech, and it should go well beyond tech. I will note, though, two things about tech is that a lot of these tech entrepreneurs are business-to-business models. And going to something that Ira mentioned, I mean, one of the great things for an entrepreneur in the Chicago area or in the Midwest is that there are all these big established companies, middle market or even larger, who are the buyers. That's the consumer for them, not someone at home. So some of the startups we've seen that have been very successful are doing human resource management online or using database tools. And those are things that they may be tech, but they're coming into other kinds of mainline businesses and lowering costs in those businesses and making those businesses more efficient. So they're spilling over their benefits into existing companies. The other thing about tech, and the reason we see a lot of tech, and we might want to encourage it as well, though, is that tech is pretty easy to enter. If it's web-based development, as I think others alluded to, the capital costs for starting up a company to provide a web service is very low compared to, say, a clean energy company or a new form of nuclear reactor. I mean, those are very expensive, hard to get into. You need a lot more human capital, people with PhDs. You need a lot more physical capital and financial capital to even roll the dice on some of those ideas. And as an example, the iPhone. Take the iPhone platform. Very low cost platform, reaches a lot of consumers. That was put in place by Apple. There were 80,000 different companies developing for that platform within 2 years. 80,000 different companies. So it's so easy to enter on that platform, come up with an app, and you can sell it. That's a kind of 80,000 different companies is at least 80,000 jobs because there's at least one person. So I think that tech can be a source of growth, and that's something where I think Chicago has lagged, and you see much more on the coasts. And if we can get into that, because the entry costs are low, I think it could be great and have spillovers all over the place.
I saw some other hands. Yeah, I'm sorry, at this table.
First question for Professor Makhija. I hope I say that correctly.
That's fine.
You talked about the middle market growing, but at a faster pace than the economy as a whole. So that presumably the big guys or the little companies are retracting. You would think, I would think.
Well, yeah, certainly there were periods where we could see that there was retraction on at least the large, so for example, if you take the recession from 2007 to 2010, if I remember the numbers correctly, large firms actually lost a net 3.5 or 3.7 million jobs. But during that same period, middle market firms actually added 2.2 million jobs. So there has been a kind of a transfer of that kind. And it has very many interesting implications. One of which is that middle market actually began to get top flight talent, which was being attracted by the best firms. So at one point, I even looked at state by state to see where the growth of the middle market firms was and where was the retraction by the large firms. And I kind of found that parallel taking place. So there is some evidence that the middle market firms may have grown even though the other sectors necessarily did not.
Well, and the follow-up question to that is really relative to what Caralynn and Nowinski was talking about with the large corporate research centers reducing their spend, which would be in the top sector, but the middle market still growing more robustly. So is that just for is that a temporary phenomenon? They can do that for a period of time, but it's, at some point there's diminishing returns, or there's other threats to the middle market, or is that large corporate research driver, if you will, potentially not as important as it used to be because of the diffusion of technology, and Apple could launch a new product and 80,000 developers are out there 2 years later.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent observation. The way I view the ecosystem as a whole is I think there is a role for all three. And the only reason that I placed emphasis on the middle is because I think historically it's been ignored. But clearly there are linkages across all three. Clearly middle market firms are born out of smaller firms. And in fact, at one time I looked at statistics as to how many large firms had emerged from middle market firms. So this is a little dated data because I had data for 2010 going backwards. And what I found is that some 27% of large firms at that point had been middle market firms barely 5 years earlier. And if you think of the economy as a whole, when large firms, for example, go abroad, they take their supply chain with them, and a whole lot of that supply chain is middle market firms. So I think there are positive synergies across the sectors. It's just that the middle, because it hasn't been that organized, doesn't have the volume of the small, deep pockets of the large, I think is bearing some burdens a little more. And when you look across the world, you find the middle markets in other countries provide us some very good examples to emulate. The Mittelstand in Germany, for example, has tremendous amount of, for example, exports. Our middle market is really lagging in exports. But that's not true for the Mittelstand. And not only in Europe, they're exporting all over the world. So there are many, I think your point is well taken.
David?
A couple of things that have been coming through in the panel and earlier today. The importance of innovation to the Midwest economy. Various comments on these large companies around the Midwest. We have a big share of Fortune 500 companies. Is there really a different risk profile here than what we might find on the West Coast, say? And for example, people are comfortable in large corporate environments. Regular paychecks is a different risk profile. People around the room are comfortable with middle market companies that are already producing revenues. They're not in initial stage larger risk. Do you think it's overblown to say there is a different cultural risk profile here? And if there is, what can we do about it at a more fundamental level to get people into more of an innovation mindset and investing in that?
I do think there is a different risk profile. I mean, if you look at, I'll just give you an example. For people in the Bay Area, it's not uncommon for someone to be, have been in the working world for, let's say, 8 years and have 5 different companies on their resume because they've gone from, startup to startup to startup. Here, at least historically, you know, you look at the person and you wonder, well, can they, you know, have they been able to hold down a job? So I think it is changing, though. Like, I felt, you know, I grew up in the Chicago area. I went to University of Illinois. I went to University of Chicago for graduate school. Then I lived in New York for 6 years, and I came back about 7 years ago. And I've definitely felt, you know, for many of the companies that we've invested in, it definitely has gotten easier and easier to attract good talent away from big business. You know, there are people who are kind of looking for more interesting opportunities as long as the company has funding. You know, we recently hired someone who is the chief marketing officer at Alberto Culver to work at one of our companies. And, you know, we interviewed a lot more people who are in larger corporations, and it definitely feels like it's getting a little bit better, but it's, you know, it's not the same as, definitely not the same as the Bay Area. So I don't know if anyone else.
I would just add, I think it's a great question. I mean, certainly startups are, you know, it's 3 people who love risk. I mean, that's, you know, to be an entrepreneur is a risky proposition, and venture capitalists love risk. It's the highest sort of risk-loving class of finance. So in some levels, they're kind of exceptional. I think, you know, when you think about middle market versus very large corporations, it's more of a professional, ongoing research and development enterprise, and managing a research and development enterprise within your firm to produce new products and better versions of your own products. And then separately, I think, you know, coming back to some comments about trade, it's about becoming the big multinational. It's about going abroad and entering new markets. So taking products that you do, things that you learn to do well, and taking them into those new markets and finding growth. Actually, Anil might be able to speak to this, but my understanding is that if you look at the middle market and you look at which ones are high growing, and I think I'm quoting an Ohio State study, that's why I'm looking to him, you know, which ones grow fastest? Those who are doing a lot of R&D and those who are going abroad.
Exactly.
You know, and so I think you know, it's the same lessons. It's not, there's no mystery here. And I think culturally, it's maybe recognizing that in your firm. And you know, sometimes we can be complacent in certain situations. And if you're a firm that wants to get out of complacency and wants to get to the next level, then I think those are your most likely 2 key channels to drive down.
Let me just add, in a former life, I actually was equity investor in early stage technology firms. We did deals here in the Chicago area as well as on the Bay Area, the West Coast. And there is truly a cultural difference. However, to your last question, which is, what can we do about that? I think it's happening. I think, you know, the advent of initiatives like the Polsky Center, the 1871, and the various accelerators that are happening. What's happening is kind of a knowledge transfer. I think what's happening in general, very simplistically, is that entrepreneurs and young entrepreneurs are learning how to do this. You know, on the West Coast, that knowledge transfer happens very early and very broadly. And so I remember when we would go to try to get talent for our startups. I mean, you know, our engineers come in the door asking for equity. In here in Illinois, that was probably 1 out of every 15 or 20 our engineer would ask for equity. So, but it's changed over the years. But it's changing very, very basically based on knowledge transfer, just information. And I think it's happening now, not as fast as we would like, but it's happening.
Hasn't it also changed, coming back to the question you were asking at your table about R&D, that the hordes of cash that Ben mentioned earlier and Anil mentioned, they're buying R&D now. Yep, thanks, Ben. Companies are buying R&D. I'm going out and making an acquisition of $500 million to buy the research and development of a company that's a great prospect. And it's conceivable, as opposed to spending money, Warren, on young kids who are going to make, you know, take that risk. We don't have to transfer the risk to individuals, but rather by corporations that are doing that R&D that's proven. I had another question out here.
What are we looking at when we're trying to deal with right to work? We know that there is a benefit to having right to work.
Wow, you've stymied the panel. I was going to ask a question of gender equity earlier, but that
anything that
better.
makes it more difficult to hire somebody makes it less likely that someone will be hired. You want to think of 2 things when it comes to a job. People are hired, just like me as a professor. I'm what is called derived demand. I'm hired because there are students that have to be taught. If there were no students, they wouldn't need me. And the ability then to hire the right person and to have the fewest possible regulations, and in some sense, to not in any way regulate the cost of what you have to pay to get an employee. If the market can set the price, if the market can be free to operate, you're going to get the most efficient outcome. So anything that makes it harder for firms to hire makes it less likely that someone will be hired. And the same goes, I know there's a big debate right now about the minimum wage and how you could be so cold-hearted as to not want it to rise because people need money and to survive. I understand that, but we're not paid for what we need, we're paid for what we do. And once we recognize that, if you purposefully make it more expensive to hire someone and they don't have the ability to produce that much output, they're just not going to be hired. They'll be replaced by a machine or something else. And it will appear that the people remaining, their productivity has risen. Well, of course it's risen because you're now giving them more capital to work with, but you will have fewer people working. So I think that's the basic economic principle behind it. The reason many of these kinds of laws exist is because it's a political solution. It is having special interests, getting politicians to do what they want, to somehow do something to competition, and that's what, even you look at something like taxi cabs. To drive a taxi cab, you have to have a medallion.
More advantageous for a company to go to Indiana or go to Michigan to start.
It could be. See, that's the data were very interesting that Ira was showing there, but you must think if somebody if I have nothing that's truly keeping me in any one location. If I need to start a business, where will I go? And I will go to where I have the fewest impediments. And that's why even, I guess rich people, I'm not there yet, that they don't respond to taxes. I guess it seems to me there's a lot of people living in Florida for one reason, and that's because they don't have an income tax, nor Tennessee, nor Nevada, nor Alaska, and so forth. That these kinds of things really do matter. So in this one study I was trying to put my finger on, I couldn't get it in time. It had to do with this state-to-state competitiveness, and it has to do with how friendly is a state to businesses trying to hire people and so forth. What kind of impediments, what kind of regulations and so forth do you put into place? And states which try to be, in a sense, more open, let the labor market operate, are ones which have stronger job growth. And so and to me it seems obvious, but there's always that social side to it as well. I understand the economic side, which is an efficient outcome. It may not be considered what we would call a fair outcome. But we economists have very little to say about fairness. We can say a lot about efficiency. It's the fairness where we bump heads with someone.
One last question we had back here. I'm sorry. Yep.
Yes, just to repeat one of the things that you pointed out. There was a book written a few years ago called The Creative Class, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that brings a person into an area to live? And what they really enjoy is people who are very similar.
Mm-hmm.
And people who enjoy the same culture. When we look at the Midwest and the cultural scene, there are very few cities that can compare with Chicago.
Oh, sure.
Which to me bodes well from a social standpoint in the evolution of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Great source of business going forward. Again, I'm an optimist.
Yeah, and as am I. I'm an optimist as well, but understand that a lot of the jobs that we're talking about here, job creation, if we want job creation, I mean, I started out pumping gasoline. I was a pump jockey. We need to create jobs pretty much at the bottom to get the people going, to learn how to come on time and to realize that there's rewards and payoffs from work and so forth. And the fact that we can bring in these entrepreneurs into Chicago, because just the Chicago, everything about Chicago is really a neat place except for the weather. It's really, really a neat place. But so is Madison and one of the most livable cities in Columbus. And, and I know I just saw one of the international firms just said that Pittsburgh, my hometown, is one of the best places in the country to live. And so there's a lot of nice places to live that maybe are a little more friendly and not corrupt.
We've got to wrap it up. I want to thank our panelists for participating. They will be up here for a little bit, so if you've got additional questions, please bring them up. We talked today about a wide variety of things, all the way from public and private partnership to technology companies to R&D to innovation to clusters. You can find all of our discussion materials on acgchicago.com. Please access it. Also, for those non-members in the audience, Ada just said to somebody earlier today, why aren't you a member? I asked that same question of you. Thanks for participating, everyone.
State-to-state competitiveness, and it has to do with how friendly is a state to businesses trying to hire people and so forth. What kind of impediments, what kind of regulations and so forth do you put into place? And states which try to be, in a sense, more open, let the labor market operate, are ones which have stronger job growth. And so it just, and to me it seems obvious, but there's always that social side to it as well. I understand the economic side, which is an efficient outcome. It may not be considered what we would call a fair outcome. But we economists have very little to say about fairness. We can say a lot about efficiency. It's the fairness where we bump heads with some.
One last question we had back here. I'm sorry. Yep.
Yes, just to repeat one of the things that you pointed out. There was a book written a few years ago called The Creative Class, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that brings a person into an area for living? And what they really enjoy is people who are very similar,
Mm-hmm.
and people who enjoy the same culture. When we look at the Midwest and the cultural scene, there are very few cities that can compare with Chicago.
Oh, sure.
Which to me bodes well from a social standpoint in the evolution of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Great source of business going forward. Again, I'm an optimist.
Yeah, and as am I. I'm an optimist as well, but understand that a lot of the jobs that we're talking about here, job creation, if we want job creation, I mean, I started out pumping gasoline. I was a pump jockey. We need to create jobs pretty much at the bottom to get the people going, to learn how to come on time and to realize that there's rewards and payoffs from work and so forth. And the fact that we can bring in these entrepreneurs into Chicago, because just the Chicago, everything about Chicago is really a neat place except for the weather. It's really, really a neat place. But so is Madison and one of the most livable cities in Columbus. And, and I know I just saw one of the international firms just said that Pittsburgh, my hometown, is one of the best places in the country to live. And so there's a lot of nice places to live that maybe are a little more friendly and not corrupt.
We've got to wrap it up. I want to thank our panelists for participating. They will be up here for a little bit, so if you've got additional questions, please bring them up. We talked today about a wide variety of things, all the way from public and private partnership to technology companies to R&D to innovation to clusters. You can find all of our discussion materials on acgchicago.com. Please access it. Also, for those non-members in the audience, Ada just said to somebody earlier today, why aren't you a member? I asked that same question of you. Thanks for participating, everyone.